Back when our kids were little, pretty young, so probably 20 plus years ago, I did something that was very unusual for me. I decided to be spontaneous. I am not usually a spontaneous kind of guy. But on this one day, for whatever reason, I decided to be spontaneous. And I said to my wife, Janine, I said, let's go to Six Flags. Let's just go. Let's just pack up everybody, the kids. Let's just get in the car. Let's drive to Arlington tonight. And we'll find a hotel, and then tomorrow morning we'll get up, and we'll go to Six Flags all day, and then we'll drive home. We'll get home late tomorrow night, and it'll only be one day out of our schedule, but let's just do it. We haven't been to Six Flags in a while. Let's just go to Six Flags, and let's just go to right now. And Janine was surprised because that's not normal for me. You know, I normally would have planned things a lot or thought about it a lot before I'd ever. No, but for whatever reason, I was spontaneous that day. And she's like, well, okay. And so she packed up the kids and packed up stuff for her and probably for me too. And by the time we finally got on the road, it was kind of late. Now remember, I said this is about 20 years ago. So there's no cell phones. There's no checking stuff on your phone on your way down there. I said, we'll just find a hotel when we get there. You know, there'll be a place with rooms. And we get to Arlington, which is where Six Flags is, and we go to the first hotel, and there's no rooms there. They're full. Apparently there's like a convention maybe or something going on. They said, oh, there's a lot of people in town. Oh, okay. So we go to the next place, and again, no rooms. And we're like, uh-oh, this is not good. And so went to another place. Again, the sign, no vacancy. And I'm thinking, this is why I'm not spontaneous. This is why we don't do things like that. But eventually, we did find a place. We had to go a little farther out from Six Flags, but eventually we found a place. But I know when we got turned down or when we found about the third hotel without rooms, I just remember thinking, we're just like Mary and Joseph. It's just like us. We're just exactly like Mary and Joseph. Except, of course, Janine was not pregnant, and we had money, and we had a car with air conditioning, and we had lots of other resources and advantages that they didn't have. Mary and Joseph did not have a car. We're not even sure they had a donkey. Now, a lot of the pictures, of course, have Mary riding a donkey. The Bible never mentions a donkey. There may have been a donkey, we don't know, but it never mentions a donkey. They didn't have a car, and they weren't going on vacation. They weren't going to Six Flags on their journey. They were traveling 80 miles, probably on foot, maybe a donkey. They weren't going to an amusement park. They were instead going to go pay taxes, not a fun trip. To go register for a tax census, taxes paid to the Roman Empire, which was the empire that had conquered the Jewish people and had them under their thumb, had them under subjugation. And so this was not a pleasure trip. Now, like us, they did not have cell phones. So they did not have a reservation in Bethlehem. And they did not find a room on the second or the third or the fourth try. What they could find eventually was a stable, a barn, which we now think the barn was probably actually a cave, a little grotto that had been used as a place to keep animals. Now, this little town of Bethlehem that we sing about, Janine and I have been to Bethlehem in the Holy Land twice. The last time we were there was just earlier this year when we took about 40 people from our church, including some of you here. And Bethlehem, modern Bethlehem, is in Palestinian territory, what's called the West Bank, which means you have to leave Israel and you go through a checkpoint and you're now in an area that is controlled by the Palestinian Authority. And there inside the Palestinian Authority on the West Bank is a church called the Church of the Nativity, a church built on the traditional site of Jesus' birth. And when you go there, you get off your bus, and you pass by a lot of propaganda for Palestinians, and you get to the Church of the Nativity, and you walk down to this little door, and you go inside this church. And the church has big columns, and you get closer to the front of the church, and there's lots of chandeliers hanging there, and there's lots of ornamentation. You find out the church is actually run by 3 different denominations, by the Roman Catholic Church, by the Greek Orthodox Church, by the Armenian Church, and they all share the space and kind of argue over the space. And then you go down to a staircase, and you stand in a long line to go down a staircase, and at the bottom of that staircase is this little grotto, and in this little grotto, it's not very big, it's surrounded by candles. There's a spot in the floor. And that spot on the floor, again, is surrounded by little lamps and candles. And in the middle of the floor, there is a silver star. And you get down close, and you're only given a few seconds to actually pause and maybe kneel down and look at that star in the floor. And in that, you can't read it from this picture, but carved around that star, it says, Hic de Virgin Maria Jesus Christus natus est, which is Latin, which translates to, here Jesus Christ was born to the Virgin Mary. Here Jesus Christ was born to the Virgin Mary. Now, do we know with absolute certainty that that is the exact spot where Jesus was born? We do not know that with absolute complete certainty, but we do know that people have been gathering there and worshiping on that spot to worship the birthplace of Jesus. People have been worshiping there since the year 333. Not 1333, no, the year 333. In other words, nearly 1,700 years, people have been coming to that place to worship on the spot where Jesus was born. Now, it was 333 when the first church was built there. But it's been built and rebuilt and torn down and burned down and rebuilt many, many times. And the current structure, even both times we've been there, has still been under renovation as they continue to try to keep this building from leaking and falling down. And it's a very ornate church. Lots of decoration. Now, it wasn't ornate 2,000 years ago when it was just a cave. It was not ornate at all. And the story that we remember every year, we know the basics of this story. We know about the angel coming to Mary, telling her that she was going to bear the Messiah, the Son of God, even though she was a virgin, that the Holy Spirit would overshadow her and that the child within her would be called the Son of God. We know that when she tells Joseph about it, he doesn't believe her, and we can't blame really Joseph for that. It's a pretty unusual story. It's not until an angel appears to Joseph in a dream that he believes Mary. And they begin to prepare for this awesome responsibility there in Nazareth, until they get the notice that there's going to be a tax census and that everybody has to go to their hometown to register. And Joseph's hometown is 80 miles to the south in Bethlehem. Joseph is part of the line of the great King David. Joseph is a descendant of the line of David, a hereditary line of kings that long ago had ceased. And so the two of them travel, maybe with a donkey, maybe not, but they travel 80 miles during the end of her pregnancy. There's no exemptions for pregnant women. And when they arrive at this small town of Bethlehem, sort of a suburb of Jerusalem, there's no place. The place is overrun with people. There's lots of other people there for the same reason they're there. And there's no guest rooms. There's no vacancies. There's no place for them. And as we know, the Son of God is born in a barn, probably in a cave. The Bible says there was no room. Now, it might be just as accurate to say nobody made room for them. No one was willing to make room for them. Think about it. None of the people who lived there in Bethlehem were willing to take in a couple of strangers into their house. None of the residents of Bethlehem were willing to open their doors to a young couple with an obviously pregnant woman, and think about all the mess and the trouble that would bring to their little house. So nobody was willing to make room for them. No one was willing to make room for Mary and Joseph that night. And the reason I said, think about the phrase, make room. Think about the phrase, make room. You know, we make room all kinds of places in our lives. When you're at a big building and the elevator door is open and it's kind of full, and you think, can two more people get on? And like, well, we'll make room, and the people scoot a little bit closer together and make room for a couple more people on the elevator. Maybe you've set the table for guests and you've set the table for 8 people, and you got 8 matching chairs and 8 matching plates, and it's all set for 8, and then somehow somebody brings along an extra person. You got 9 people for dinner and 8 spots. Well, we'll make room. We'll pull in another chair. We'll get another plate out, even if it doesn't match the other plates. We'll scoot everybody a little closer together. We'll make room. We make room. The biggest example of making room is probably what Paige and Ryan are going to be going through, making room for a baby. That's the biggest make room situation there is, because, it's goodbye craft room, or goodbye man cave, or goodbye office, or goodbye comic book room, or whatever that might be, because you got to make room for a baby. And that's not an act of drudgery. That's not a sad thing. It's a happy thing. And whatever was occupying that space, it has to go to the attic or the garage or the closet or a storage unit or wherever, because you got to make room for a baby. Now, I bring up that phrase, making room, because here's the truth. In our lives, we have to make room for Jesus. In our daily lives, we have to make room for Jesus. And I don't just mean baby Jesus at Christmas time. I mean every day, every season, all the time. We have to make room for Christ in our daily routine, in our daily calendar. We have to make room for him in the calendar, in the checkbook, or whatever. People don't use checkbooks anymore. We got to make room for him in all the facets of our lives. Because Jesus doesn't become part of your life just by accident, just by osmosis. Now, if you're raised in a Christian household, you got a big head start. If you are raised coming to church, you got a big head start. But even if you're raised by Christian parents, even if you are raised in church, you still have to make the decision to invite Christ into your life. You still have to make room for him. You have to make room for him in your life, and that often means rearranging things. Jesus says in Revelation 3:20, he's talking to the churches, "Here I am, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come in and eat with that person, and they with me." Now, notice just how Jesus phrases that analogy. He's knocking at the door. What do we have to do? We have to open it. And that's what it means to have Christ come into your life. He doesn't just slip in. He doesn't just sneak in. We have to open a door and invite him in and make room for him. Making room for Jesus may mean you got to clear some other stuff out. There may be some things in your life that just are not compatible with Jesus being in your life. And it's like, well, either Jesus is going to be in my life or this other thing is going to be in my life. And if I invite Jesus and make room for him in my life, these other things, they have to go out to the curb. They have to go in the trash. Or other things, you don't have to get rid of them, but you have to reprioritize. Other things have to take a lower priority once you've invited Jesus to come. Once you make room for Jesus, you have to make room for him at the top. And other things may have to take a lower place. You have to rearrange your schedule. You have to rearrange things to make room for Jesus. But that's what it is to follow him, to make room in your heart, to make room in your life. It's pretty hard to misunderstand this analogy when Jesus says, "I'm knocking, and I want to come in. I want you to make room for me, but you're going to have to open the door. and then you're going to make a place for me. And that may mean some shuffling of stuff around. There's a magazine that's been around for a long time called Guideposts, and it's often full of inspiring stories. And not too long ago, they reprinted a story they ran way back in the 60s, in 1966. And this story is one of my favorites. It's about a boy named Wallace Perling. Okay? Now, back in 1966, Wallace was 9 years old and in the second grade. You realize, okay, he was held back a year, and he was naturally a big kid. So he's a big kid. He was held back a year. He was not real great academically, a little bit slow, a little bit awkward, but he was a kid with a big heart, a really big-hearted kid, a good kid. Everybody liked Wallace. And being such a big kid in second grade, being so much bigger than the other kids, he could have easily become a bully, but he wasn't a bully at all. Instead, he was kind of protective of the younger kids and the small kids, always saying, well, let's let them play, or always inviting them, always smiling, always helpful, just a good kid. Now, in those days, believe it or not, you could, in public school, they did Christmas pageants. and that's hard to imagine, 50 plus years later, different understanding of separation of church and state. But in those days, they actually could do Christmas pageants at school. And the second graders were going to do a Christmas pageant. And when I say a Christmas pageant, in other words, the kids were going to be, Mary and Joseph and angels and shepherds and wise men, the whole thing. And, the paper wings and the phony beards and the cardboard crowns and the baby doll Jesus and the bathrobes and the whole thing to put on a Christmas pageant. And Wallace, he wanted to be a shepherd. But the teacher, Miss Lombard, she had a different idea. She wanted Wallace to be the innkeeper. Because she thought, since he was kind of big, it would be more intimidating when they came to the door and he told them to get out of here, She wanted Wallace to be the innkeeper. And the innkeeper didn't have that many lines. And she thought the scene would be impressive when they were turned away. And so she gave him the part of the innkeeper. And Wallace was just transfixed by this whole experience and learned his lines. And the night of the play, the night of the pageant, he's off stage watching the whole thing. He's hanging on every word. He's focused. And he's waiting for his big moment to come on and do his part. And finally that part of the story comes. And here comes little 7-year-old Mary and 7-year-old Joseph. And they come to the door, the phony door that's been put on stage. And Wallace comes out as the innkeeper. And he's been told to be gruff, And he's like, what do you want? And little Joseph says, we seek lodging. And Wallace says, seek it elsewhere. The inn is filled. And little Joseph says, sir, we have asked everywhere in vain. We have traveled far and we are very weary. And Wallace says, there is no room in this inn for you. And he's looking properly stern. And little Joseph says to him, please, good innkeeper, this is my wife, Mary. She is heavy with child and needs a place to rest. Surely you must have some small corner for her. She is so tired. Now, Wallace looked at 7-year-old Mary in her blue robe and her little headpiece. And there was a long pause, an awkward pause. And Miss Lombard is off stage, and just in case she decides to whisper and prompt him, she says, no, be gone. No, be gone. And Wallace kind of comes back to himself and says, no, be gone. And so as he's been instructed, little Joseph puts his arm around the little Mary, and she lays her head on his shoulder, and the two of them start to sadly walk away. And Wallace stays on stage. His mouth is open. His brow is creased with concern. His eyes start to fill with tears. And suddenly, this Christmas pageant became very different from every other Christmas pageant. As Wallace said, "Don't go, Joseph. Bring Mary back. You can have my room." Now, some people thought Wallace ruined the play, but they were in the minority. Because most people, many people, considered it to be the most Christmassy Christmas pageant that they had ever seen. Because you have to make room for Jesus.